You could probably start whenever you're ready.
It sounds good. Well, maybe we'll start with just a thank you to everyone who dialed in today. I know that it's a really interesting year to be out there on the trail, and especially during a global pandemic, there's a whole set of considerations to take into account before heading out there. So we want to thank you for planning and preparing in the right way and for engaging with us so you can learn about what our recommendations are and to kind of flip the script a little bit and talk about what it's like being a person of color out on the trail, which, I think myself, I thru hiked in 2015, and Sahaj, who's our co-host today, also is out there on the trail and is a key member of the Appalachian Trail Conservancy's volunteer staff. So I want to start with some introductions. Sahaj, if you want to start, I'll piggyback there and then we can dive right into the topics at hand.
My name is Sahaj. I'm originally from the New York City area, and I am on the ATC's Next Generation Council. Professionally, I work as a water wastewater engineer, and currently living out in a small town in California. But it's great to be here this morning, and I'm sure we'll have a great conversation.
Sahaj, do you want to maybe tell a little bit about your relationship to the AT and what you've hiked and a little bit more about just your hiking experience overall?
Sure, yeah. I am my relationship to the AT currently is through the ATC because I'm able to give back in a cool way without actually being on the trail, as traditionally you might be familiar with. I got familiar with the trail in high school through Grand Rock Hudson Valley, and my relationship really started there with some trail clearing efforts and taking care of our local New York trails. And through that, I was introduced to further trails through Bear Mountain and then the Appalachian Trail there. I've hiked parts of the AT that goes through New Jersey and New York and the New Jersey Trail Conference and the Delaware Water Gap. Currently planning a through hike and hoping we'll get there by next year. But again, it's a journey.
Thanks, Sahaj. So I'm Shalin. I don't think I've met anyone here before, but I thru hiked the trail in 2015. That was my first thru hike. And then in the subsequent years, I thru hiked the Pacific Crest Trail and the Continental Divide Trail. And I think that I can best describe my Appalachian Trail experience as narcotic because I was hooked, right? Like it's kind of like you do it once and then you're like, why did I ever stop doing it? So I immediately after I came off the trail, I tried to find my way into this world known as the Appalachian Trail Conservancy. And my first stint here was on the Conservancy's board of directors for almost 3 years. And it was an incredibly interesting and fascinating experience because you're part of a governing body that takes care of so much more than just a footpath. We take care of the landscape, we take care of almost 50 AT communities. We work in conjunction with 31 trail maintaining clubs, 87 land managers, and we are basically taking care of a world that affords hikers and stewards a unique experience that you can't really find anywhere else. We're the longest hiking only footpath in the world. We're the grandmother of all long distance trails. So it's really interesting and fascinating to be in the job that I'm currently in, which is the Vice President of Advancement at the ATC. And in my job, I oversee all of our development, membership, communications, retail, visitor services, and publications. And it's been nothing less of a privilege to not only have hiked the trail, but to continue to give back and work for the Conservancy that takes care of it. Which brings me to the experience that you guys are all about to embark on, which is hiking the AT. So I am both jealous and also very excited to talk to you guys today because I think that there's some table setting to do. So before we start talking about what it's like to be a person of color on the trail, which is really a varied experience and it's a personal experience, I want to talk about what it's like just to be on trail in general and some of the things to think about in 2021. So let's start with just the basics. So the length of the trail is currently, and I say currently because the trail length changes at times due to relocations or sometimes just calculations, is currently 2,193.1 miles. It extends from Springer Mountain, which is the southern terminus in Georgia, to Katahdin in Maine. And I've learned to disabuse myself of calling it Mount Katahdin because that's redundant. It's just Katahdin. So if you guys are telling people where you're going to end up if you're going northbound, just say Katahdin. It is a trail that requires a large community to manage it. It's currently managed through something called the Cooperative Management System. That system is the result of something that we call the National Trail Systems Act of 1968, which was further amended in 1978 and includes three distinct parts. The first is the conservancy itself, that's the Appalachian Trail Conservancy. The second are the 31 trail maintaining clubs that quote unquote own sections of the trail and actually do the on the ground maintenance of their sections of the trail. And then 87 distinct land managers, which range from local to state level to federal agencies that either administer the land or own it outright. It currently covers 14 states, some in part, so Maine and Georgia in part, and it goes absolutely through 12 others. It goes through 6 national parks, including Shenandoah and the Great Smokies, and then 8 national forests, including the Whites and the Green Mountain National Forest. We currently estimate, and actually, I'm going to put a caveat here. We say that there's 3 to 4 million visitors per year, but in the pandemic, people came out in droves to the AT. And this is going to be an important point to come back to later, which is that visitor use on the trail, that's the term that we use for hikers being out there, has just exponentially increased. Examples include anecdotes from all of our agency partners that say that cars literally line the roads outside of trailheads because all they want to do is hike. But we also know because there are certain agencies that are tracking visitorship, and it's just increased by 200, 300% over the pandemic. In terms of stewards of the trail, so if you think about those millions of visitors have the experience that they're having because of 6,000 volunteers, which if you look at that ratio, it's a head scratcher. Like, why do we only have 6,000 people out there making an experience possible for millions of people? So one of the things that I hope that you'll walk away with after this session is think about that ratio of volunteers to hikers and maybe try to jump the fence after your AT through hike and join that group of 6,000 that makes this experience possible for everyone else. And in total, those 6,000 people give 200,000 hours of service every year. So we are very fortunate to have these incredibly dedicated, incredibly passionate people with us. And I count Sahaj as one of them because he is, at the end of the day, a volunteer with the ATC. All right. So there are ways to hike, different ways to hike. So y'all are probably coming to us because many of you are through hiking or planning a through hike in 2021. But there are different ways to think about a through hike. Through hikes typically take less than 12 months or so, and you can go northbound, which means you're starting in Springer, ending at Katahdin, or you can go southbound, which means you're starting at Katahdin and ending at Springer. But there's other ways too. We have an alternate method called flip-flops. And the most popular flip-flop method is to start in Harper's Ferry, which is the psychological halfway point in the trail, and go north or south, come back to Harper's Ferry, and then do the other half. But flip-flops can also be done at different starting locations. So you can start in, let's say, for example, Boiling Springs, Pennsylvania, head north, come back to Boiling Springs, and head south. One of the true advantages of doing either a southbound or flip-flop hike is that you avoid the crowds. So a vast majority of people are going northbound, and actually a vast majority of them are starting in a very narrow window between the end of February and the beginning of April. So if you're keen to avoid the crowds, which is, not a small consideration in a pandemic, consider doing either a southbound hike or a flip-flop hike, which would set you up to avoid those droves of hikers who are going to be out there on the trail. The other way to think about long distance hikes are section hikes. So we have, we call them lashers. It's an acronym for long ass section hikers. And people wear that badge proudly. I'm not gonna lie to you. Like I am a lasher. We have a lot of people on staff at the Appalachian Trail Conservancy who are through hikers, but a lot of people will be like, yeah, there's a big crowd of lashers too on staff. And what they do is just big chunks of trail at a time. And it can take up to decades. I recently met a member of the Conservancy that does, 50 to 75 miles per year, and it's just plugging away 15 years now. And she's done about 1,100 miles. So, there are people who are literally taking their time. And then there's a whole bunch of other permutations that you can think about of hiking the trail. The last piece of it is day hikers. So day hikers are the overwhelming amount of visitors to the AT. We often think about the AT in our minds, immediately go to through hiking, the end-to-end hiker, because it's such a phenomenal experience. But most people's experience on the AT is driving out to the AT, parking their car, going on a hike, and then getting back in their car and driving home. So I think that one of the things that as you think about the trail, your through hiking experience is actually the experience that very few people will do and very few people can associate with because most people are just out there for the day. So let's go on to the next one. So I'm going to take a pause here and I'm going to use my timer. So think about what you want your trail experience to be and think about this from a lot of different standpoints. Like, what do you want the weather to be like? What do you want the crowd situation to be like? What do you want to see? What do you want to experience? So let's take 30 seconds. And if you're inclined to do so, put in the chat box a couple of sentences or one or two that describes what you're thinking about when you think about your personal trails experience. So I will start now. So if you guys have some thoughts, feel free to add your comments into the chat box about what you want your trail experience to be. But one of the things I want you to think about when you're thinking about the trail experience is, let's go on to the next chart, is that your experience can be impacted by when you start. And if you take a look at the number of through hikers that are starting throughout the years, an overwhelming amount of them are going to be starting between February to April from Springer Mountain. And it's going to be dozens and dozens of hikers who are there with you, which means that at shelter sites, at campsites, even on the trail, you are going to be running into a lot of people. And already this year, we've had double the amount of registrations for through hikers than we've had in previous years, which should mean that crowding becomes an overwhelming concern and a priority factor in where and when you start your hikes in 2021. You may want to consider starting later in April if you think you can move fast, or a little bit earlier in the season if you can stand the cold, or even entertaining an alternate kind of hike in order to avoid these crowds. So let's go a deeper dive into these considerations. So if you take a look at the considerations, there's a lot to consider. There's terrain, which, like, do you want to start at Katahdin, which immediately has you going right up this pretty tough scramble, or do you want to start in Springer, which is going to put you on what I call a cardiogram? It's just like you're looking at a heart chart, you're going up and down. Do you want to start in the middle, which is a little bit easier? Do you want to start in Boiling Springs, which is relatively flat? So terrain becomes a factor in where you start and how you prepare for the trail physically and gear-wise. Crowds are going to be a consideration. We covered that with the chart that we looked at before, but then also weather. Depending on when you start, it could be snowy, it could be warm, it could be rainy, it could be a lot of things, but that time that you start is going to have a different climate through which you're traversing the trail. So let's move on there. And then also to prepare yourself philosophically about what you want your hike to be. And at the end of the day, because you're on a public resource and because you're on a trail that you share with millions of other people, you want to make sure that you're leaving no trace. And you might have heard of leave no trace before because it is the principles that guide responsible recreation. And when people think about how do I access these public outdoor spaces, they often think about leave no trace. So the first part of leave no trace is making sure that you're planning and preparing ahead. The best way to do so, at least for the AT, is to access the hiker resource library that the ATC has posted online. It is capital C comprehensive. It will get you ready for a variety of different things that you're going to encounter on the trail. The second is to make sure that you're traveling and camping on durable surfaces. So you don't want to, for example, set up your tent on a patch of vegetation, which is going to be adversely impacted if you sleep on it at night, for example. You want to dispose of waste properly. That includes human waste too. So make sure you know how to poop on the trail. When privies are closed, make sure that you know where to urinate, all that fun stuff. Leave what you find. So, taking a whole bunch of stuff from the trail, popping it in your backpack and bringing it home is not the best thing to do. minimize campfire impacts. So, I mean, at the end of the day, if you can avoid campfires, avoid them, but you don't want to set up illegal fire rings. You don't want to create a campfire that could get out of control. You don't want to be pulling in resources around a shelter site that you just want to burn so you can get a nice little bonfire. You want to respect the wildlife, which means something as simple as, if you see wildlife, leave it alone. Don't try to, bother it or provoke it. But also things like make sure that you're storing your food properly, because a bear that gets into your food suddenly becomes a problem. Be considerate of other visitors. So you're not out there alone. I know that we have this principle called hike your own hike, but hike your own hike isn't a license to do what you want. It's, I'm in this space that I share with millions of other hikers. So let's be mindful about what my behavior is and how I interact with other people on the trail. Let's move on from there. So AT Camp, this is a fun tool. I think that AT Camp has just been really important this year for a couple of reasons. The first is that because crowding is such an important concern during the pandemic, the other part of AT Camp that's going to be really important is that if you're out there and there is a critical alert that you need to know about, for example, let's say that there's an outbreak in one of the trail communities and we need to communicate that to hikers, giving us your contact information via AT Camp and registering your thru hike allows us to contact you and let you know about these incredibly important and urgent trail updates. So it's incredibly important that if you haven't registered your thru hike on atcamp.org, make sure you get out there. One of the key features that we've updated recently is that there used to be a cap of 38 at camp or shelter sites. We've removed that cap. However, if there's 38 people at a campsite, you should probably rethink staying there. You don't really want to be around 30 people in the middle of a global pandemic. So consider altering your start or timing. Let's move on from there to safety. So we're going to get into this a little bit more when we talk about what it's like to hike, what it means to be a BIPOC hiker on the trail. But with safety, the most important thing is instinct. Like you are out there and you've developed instinct over time and you know when you're safe and when you're not, listen to it. So if you feel like the weather is incredibly gnarly and you're about to approach a summit, it's probably not a good idea to be on a bald when it's lightning, then probably don't go up there, and if you feel like you're around a group of people that makes you feel unsafe, then step away from those people, so listening to your instinct and making sure that you're following your gut is going to be very important. The second is that we can't approach or resolve things that are not reported to us. So make sure that you're reporting any incidents to our website, appalachiantrail.org/incidents. Make sure that you share your itinerary, make sure that you check in regularly with people that you know and trust. And this is incredibly important too. Make sure that they understand all the various aspects of your hiking. So make sure that they know your trail name, make sure they know where you are, make sure that you trust the person that you're sharing your itinerary with. It's probably not a good idea to make your itinerary public. So you don't want to be like, hey, my name is Clarissa Foncesa and I'm hiking here and here and here and here. Makes it really easy for people to follow you in the bad way versus the good way. Consider carrying a satellite communication device. Those can be, you can find those at REI if you want to, but you can also find them on Amazon or online. Firearms are, you want to be mindful about. I know that a lot of people say, and I'll just be real honest with you, a lot of people like, there's bears out there and I'm going to carry a gun. It's probably not the best approach. So, think about firearm safety and then stay on top of weather forecasts and hazards. Oftentimes you'll find in towns that you might be able to download a 5 to 10 day weather forecast. They don't significantly change over time in my experience, but it's good to stay on top of the weather forecast. There's also cell phone reception along the trail, depending on your carrier. I had Verizon, for example, and there were only a few spots on the trail that I wasn't able to get service. So let's keep going on to safety. So you can't talk about safety without talking about COVID-19, because that's just the world we live in right now. So the most essential thing that you're going to do is gear up and understand what your role is in this larger ecosystem. So if you think about PPE, which is personal protection equipment, face coverings are absolutely mandatory on the trail right now. So there's an executive order that makes masks mandatory on federal lands right now, and the AT does go through federal lands, so make sure that you have it with you. The second is also that you're just going to encounter people. And when you're around people and you can't physically distance, you're going to want to wear that mask to keep yourself safe. The idea of carrying a personal shelter this year is no longer optional. It's pretty much mandatory. The number one way to get COVID-19 is to share airspace with people that you're not quarantining with. Well, guess what a shelter is? It's sharing airspace with people you're not quarantining with. So stay out of the shelters and make sure that you carry a personal shelter. And we say personal shelter because it could be a tent, it could be a hammock. I know Stephen, for example, carried a hammock. I carried a tent. A friend of mine carried a tarp. So it's up to you. As long as it's your own shelter and it's just you in there, you're good. And the last piece of it is, you can't really use the privies this year. So you want to carry a trowel so you can dig cat holes, and you want to have a hand washing kit and or hand sanitizer with you. I would recommend carrying both just because you may not have hand washing opportunities always. So at least you have the hand sanitizer there with you. And keep in mind, it's not just about COVID-19. There's other viruses that you can get. Norovirus, for example. I had the unfortunate experience on the Continental Divide Trail of getting Giardia. I promise you, you don't want it. So, having a hand sanitizer with you is going to be very important. And then the second part of this is resupply and town visits. Make sure that you consider every point of contact. That's getting in a car, getting in a ride, getting down to town, picking up your mail, picking up a bounce box, going into a grocery store, going into a restaurant if those are even open at this time, even going into a hostel. What are you touching? Who are you interacting with? Be very mindful. I know it's a lot, but I know that we're all doing it in every aspect of our lives. So you have to take what you're doing right now in your normal life and transfer that framework over to your trail life. And the last piece of it is maintain a shared standard of safety. So if you stay safe, it's an expectation that other people stay safe. And if we communally agree that safety is a priority, then we're all going to hopefully get through this. Yeah. So let's go on to the next one. Logistics. So make sure that you are prepping and planning by looking at the Hiker Resource Library. There's a couple of things to consider here. The first are regulations. Not everyone travels with a dog. Not everyone's going to be traveling with a bear canister, but you are going to have to figure out what's the right way to store your food, what's the right way to travel with, furry companions if you are traveling with them. So we won't go too deep into the regulations, but if any of these things do apply to you, make sure that you're accessing the Hiker Resource Library so that you can understand what the regulations are with pets or with food storage. The other thing to keep in mind is permits. There are permits in the Smokies and the Shenandoah, so make sure that you beef up on that knowledge, but also make sure that you understand what the permitting process is in Baxter State Park, which is where Katahdin is located. So you're gonna have to understand what exactly you're gonna have to prep for, how many permits are available in a given year, and when to access them and sign up for them. Also understand transportation. You don't want to just get into a rando person's car this year. It's just not safe. It's not safe generally, but it's just not safe this year. You want to be mindful of how you set up rides, who you're riding with, whether or not you need to call a shuttle driver, all that kind of fun stuff. And also, and I can't say this enough, but register your hike at atcamp.org. So in case anything happens, you have the alert from ATC. Gear. So I know that I am a gear queer. I love talking about gear, but I won't get too deep into that rabbit hole right now. There are a lot of things to consider around gear, and there's a lot of gear out there, but really let's focus on the basics, right? The first is the big three. So backpack, absolutely, you got to carry this stuff with you. You got to sleep at night, so you have to have a sleeping system, and you got to have you have to have a temporary roof over your head, which means you have to have a shelter. So the backpack, on average, it goes from 45 to 60 liters on average. Some people go smaller, some people go bigger. I have a 40-liter backpack, a Hyperlight Mountain Gear. The person that I hiked with on the trail had a 75-liter backpack. So it ranges. It really does, at the end of the day, though, depend on what's comfortable for you and what's going to fit your gear, your overall gear. So don't let, some one size fits all website tell you this is exactly what you have to carry and you're a dummy if you don't carry ultralight. At the end of the day, if you're not comfortable with your backpack, then you're not going to be comfortable for 2,000 plus miles. You don't want to be in that situation. So make sure that you've carried your backpack before you get out to the start location. Make sure that it sits well on your shoulders and your hips, which are going to carry most of the weight. Make sure that it fits your body, all that kind of fun stuff. Your sleeping system is about getting a good night's sleep because you're going to want to rest, but it's also about staying warm. So make sure that you have a sleeping pad, some type of insulating layer. So either a quilt, a sleeping bag, a mummy system, whatever works for you. Again, just like the backpack, this is about your comfort and your safety and your ability to stay warm and get a good night's rest. So you're going to want to be able to tailor this to what your needs are. Some people sleep cold, some people sleep hot. So you might even choose to do a different temperature rating than what's recommended. But at the end of the day, as long as you have a sleep system with you at all times, that's a good thing. The last thing is shelter, and I won't go too deep into this. Again, this is preference. You could carry a tent. It could be a 2-person tent if you want space. It could be a 1-person tent if you like to keep tight. It could be a tarp. It could be a hammock. At the end of the day, if it works for you, it works for you. And as long as it keeps you dry, and as long as you have that shelter and it's just you and it keeps you out of the 3-wall shelters, then you're good to go. The second big thing this year is trowels. That's to dig cat holes. I won't go too deep into that because we have a really good kind of 1-pager on our website on how to get rid of human waste in the backcountry. I highly, highly, highly recommend that you review that. Cat holing is a science. It's not so much an art. So I would highly recommend that you figure out how to get scientific with your poop. Food storage systems are going to be important. Bear canisters are absolutely what we recommend. But if you are not planning to carry a bear canister, make sure you know how to keep your food safe from wildlife. I don't think about food storage as keeping my food safe. I think of it as keeping wildlife safe. The last thing that I want is a bear or a raccoon or a porcupine to get into my food, suddenly become acclimated to human food, and then all of a sudden they become a problem. Used gear, you can get used gear everywhere. I know that cost is a concern, right? Like gear ain't cheap. So you might want to look at consignment shops. There's geartrade.com, which is a pretty good website for finding gear from former thru-hikers. You can find gear on Craigslist even. I got a Western mountaineering quilt that was $700 for only 150 off Craigslist. So I highly recommend it. But you might also find things like backpacks, which can go for over $300 a pop for pretty cheap. For COVID-19, the 2 absolute must are a mask and hand sanitizer. So I don't think I need to go too deep into that. And then make sure that by the end of what you do, once you collect all your gear, make sure that you look at it critically, see what you need, what's extra. And then you want to aim for less than 25% of your body weight. I think that's a pretty good general rule. And then do a shakedown hike. And I don't know if you guys have heard what a shakedown hike is. It's literally going out there for a couple of nights. I know we recommend about 3 days and 2 nights. And then try to get into a situation that's a little bit gnarly. So like cold, windy, rainy, like kind of an inclement situation, and see if your gear works for you. Like I'm a big Brene Brown person, and she always says, if it doesn't serve you, then you shouldn't serve it. The same thing goes for your gear. So I will stop there. If you have any questions, you can pop them up in the chat box. But I'm going to switch over to Sahaj so that we can get into the topic of today's session and focus on hiking while being Black, Indigenous, or a person of color. Sahaj, you want to take it away?
Yeah, thank you, Sheldon. Thanks for covering the overall strategies on the AT. We'll go into a little bit about what it is thru-hiking the AT while being BIPOC, which stands for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color. The AT experience will differ for everyone, and each person hiking the AT has their identity markers, right? But the key is that those markers could be perceived differently, but by other people, and that's something you have to stay aware of. And we'll go into a few things that people should consider as BIPOC while they plan their thru-hike. And before that, I just want to say this is not meant to be a lecture, but more of a discussion. So feel free to use the chat box. If you want to say something, you have the power to unmute your mic and bring something up. We'll talk about the on-trail experience. Now, first we'll cover this data from the trek.com, and it's not specifically thru-hikers, but long-distance hikers on the AT in the year 2019. Now, you can see the pie graph, and it's mostly green. So that stands for most of the hikers on the AT in the year 2019, long-distance hikers, were white and non-Hispanic. You know, the 72% had bachelor's degrees or higher. So the demographics are real, you know, we can say are educated and affluent. It's important to realize that most people you might see on as a BIPOC hiker, you might see on the trail, will not look like you. For a lot of reasons, your experience on the AT could be difficult, and it's not to, you know, scare anyone, but it's just to say that there's some preparation and some homework on your end as a BIPOC hiker that you might have to do before you start on your thru hike. I will kick it back to Charlene, I think, to talk about the community experience a little bit.
Yeah, this is where it gets a little fun, right? So, you know, I think that when we think about hiking while BIPOC, we think about this in terms of what the overall trail experience is going to be. But it's important to understand that the entire trail requires you as a person of color to really be aware of the situation around you. Because although we like to kind of come up with these stereotypical conceptions of what it's like to hike in the South versus what it's like to hike in the North, at the very end of the day, you're hiking in this space that's going through a variety of communities and a variety of public lands. And it requires situational awareness so that you can identify when you feel unsafe or when you feel discriminated against, or when you actually find, for example, allies who are out there and who want to welcome you and make it a more inclusive and equitable experience. So one of the things that I want to just caveat all this by saying is that there's no such thing as a overall trail experience. Everyone's trail experience is individualized and personal and can vary from person to person. You know, when I started off my hike, I ended up reaching out to over 30 people who were on what we call mentor lists. And they were broken out by identity. And I'm South Asian, I'm Indian American, and I'm also gay. So like I reached out to a whole bunch of former gay hikers and former South Asian hikers. And I would say that it was roughly 50-50. You know, like 50% of the South Asian hikers were like, yeah, I walked into town and they would call me a terrorist, or because they had beards at that point, or like they would go into a motel and they would just be followed around, or go into a grocery store and be followed around because they thought that they were shoplifting. The other 50% like, yeah, I didn't experience any discrimination at all. So again, that just underscores the point that can be a very personalized experience and that people have different experiences in different areas of the trail. That said, there is some regional difference in the trail. So the first is that there's urban and rural differences. The North is very much close to larger centers of population. For example, there are sections of the trail in New York that are literally just a couple of dozen miles from New York City. There's actually a trail that you can hike from New York City to the Appalachian Trail called the Long Path, or you can actually just jump on a train and take the train down to New York City on the Metro North. So like that's just an example, but it's also very close to Boston, it's close to DC, it's close to, you know, a couple of the bigger cities in Pennsylvania. So the northern part of the trail is very much a trail that gets that urban reach and urban demographic coming out to it. It's pretty much the opposite in the South, with the exception of Atlanta. You know, at the beginning of the trail, you're about 2 hours away from Atlanta, but the rest of the trail is in the mountains, man. You know, like you're going through like back country. So one of the things to consider is that when you're in a rural area versus an area that has closer connections to the cities, you might see a significant change in visitor use demographics, right? And so that you might find that in the first part of your trail, you're not really seeing a lot of people that you can identify with. That may change as you head closer and closer to the north. Then it probably falls away when you get into Maine, but still. So it's something to consider. The other thing is just the regional cultural differences. One of the things that we get consistently at the ATC are complaints about Confederate flags in AT communities in the South. So, you know, you have to be prepared to understand that in certain communities, we are still working with them to really talk about how these visual things can impact a hiker's experience, because a Confederate flag to a white hiker may be a very different thing than a Confederate flag to somebody who's Black, you know, and the way that they perceive that is very, very different. And we've gotten many complaints over the years that, you know, I don't feel comfortable staying in a hostel that has a Confederate flag flying over it. And that's an absolutely valid point. So just something to consider. The ATC has really started working with AT communities to figure out how we start conversations around things like race and discrimination and the impact that these historical things can have on hikers today. So it's an ongoing conversation, but while that conversation is ongoing, I think hikers just have to be aware that they just exist. So, Sahaj, back to you.
Okay, so how do we find our community on the trail? Great start is looking at affinity groups, which are groups that have one identity sector, whereas you're looking at outdoor Afro, Latinx hikers, Wildies Women, which is a branch of which is associated with the ATC, Venture Out, gayoutdoors.org, and others such as ones listed on the slide here. Another look is coalitions, which is a group of multiple identities. Examples: Diversity Outdoors, Melanin Base Camp, Unlikely Hikers. These groups are a cool way of associating yourselves with like-minded folks, but also people who look like you and have similar identity markers. So once you get on the trail, you can have whether you're just looking for a partner or you get connected to a group hiking the trail. It's just a better way to be prepared and hike the trail together. Another method, which could be quite effective, is how Shaolin just mentioned, are the mentor lists, which can be reached by emailing the ATC at info@appalachiantrail.org. And that's something that I'm going to do in the coming months, because I think it's a very direct way of people who have agreed to be a mentor to future hikers. And it doesn't get any more direct than that. So if you get into a sticky situation, Shaolin's gonna cover a few resources of who to call and how to go about it.
Yeah, so like you might find that at sometimes you do need to call for help. So 911, of course, if you're in an emergency, dial it. But the second is also if you get into a situation where there's incidents, you can report them on our website and the URL is listed there, or you can call the 24-hour National Park Service dispatch. This is a phone number actually that I put on a piece of tape and just wrapped around my hiking pole in case something happened. So that you might want to do that as well, just to have that number handy. And then also lastly, this is less formal, but we have an inbox, info@appalachiantrail.org. If you have experiences that you want to share that concerns the way that we manage and protect the trail, but also the way that we communicate with hikers and stewards, please, please, please communicate with the ATC. We actually literally look at every single email and message that comes in and try to respond to them within 48 hours. So we have that. I'm gonna end this conversation though, and then switch over to questions by talking about two things. The first is authenticity. So at the end of the day, whatever questions you might have, the most important thing, because trail experiences are so personal, is that you have the most authentic personal experience that you have on the trail as possible. So that means that you have to live your own truth out there, and that as much as we are going to be brushing up against people on the trail all the time and walking through these communities that sometimes we may not have the best experiences in, that we have to carve out our own space in this trail experience that we want to have. And the other thing is that, if we want to go on to the next slide, is that at the end of the day, don't think about this as a one and done. I've always thought about through hikes as a gateway drug to something bigger. And that bigger thing is a longer term relationship with this resource. The Appalachian Trail is not just something that you walk on for 6 months and then you call it a day. It's a resource that's been made available to millions so that you can go out there to find solace, inspiration, that you can find a way to give back by becoming a volunteer or a member of the Conservancy, or even by talking about your experience as people of color to a wider audience and really sharing this idea that this resource isn't made for a demographic that currently dominates it, that people of color, that women, that people who identify as disabled, people who identify as low income, this is a shared resource for you. So I think that we all have a responsibility to give back to this shared resource. So hopefully you'll think about your experience as not just a through hike, but the beginning of a very long-term relationship with the AT. Cool. And yeah, so I guess Catherine will switch to questions now.
Sure thing. I'll go ahead and leave this slide up for just a moment. And I think since we're not a huge group, if anybody wants to just take yourself off mute and ask questions out loud, go for it. And I'm going to catch up with what was happening in the chat box.
I'll come off of mute. This is Maria. Hi, everybody.
Cool.
So, I mean, obviously, you know, being in nature and wanting to go out there, you're looking for a sense of peace, tranquility. Do you ever see physical violence break out or have seen physical violence break out based on your experience as a person of color? Has anybody taunted you? Has anybody interrupted that peace of mind that you're looking for when you're out there?
Personally, no. The world I've seen on the trail is much nicer than the world I've seen outside. And you know, I'm from New York City. I just see a lot of things. But that's not to say, you know, most of my experience has also been during activities and smaller hikes where I have not spent much time, you know, camping at base camps and you know, in you know, southern states, or you know, I have not had much experience there. And so I am in the same boat as everybody else here, you know, and learning and preparing for my hike as well. But in terms of being active, no, I have not seen that. But maybe Sheldon can share a couple of things if he has.
Yeah, I haven't seen any like actual physical violence. The concern for me was more about the microaggressions, right? So like it's when people are just being jerks, to be honest with you. I'll give you a couple examples. Like when I was on my hike, we don't shave out there. It's just not a thing that dudes do. Like you end up seeing these Rip Van Winkle type dudes just going up and down the trail. But my beard was very much double the length of Sahaj's right now. And I remember there's this one guy who was in our bubble on the trail who just kept saying, and I don't have a trail name and I still don't have a trail name, but he kept saying that my trail name should be Osama bin Hiken. And I was like, well, yeah, correct, Sean. Yeah. You know, like it's first of all, he thought he was being funny when he was in fact being a jerk. And then he kept saying it over and over again. So the first time was not funny. The second time was very much annoying. The third time was just inappropriate and unacceptable. So like what do you do in situations where you have microaggressions like that? The first is to just state your claim and be like, you know what, this is unacceptable. I don't like it, and you're making me feel uncomfortable. So I'd appreciate if you just stay away. The second and third times is when you round your allies and say, if you do this again, we're going to have to find a way to report you and make it so that you can't actually harass me. And we're going to enforce that, if not through the towns, then as a group, and say, you cannot camp near us. We're just not going to allow it because you're harassing somebody within our own group. Now that's tough because now the burden's put on you for their bad behavior, right? Like, and why should we have to alter our behavior or accept the burden for somebody who's being a dick, you know? And at the end of the day, that's something that happened once. It's something that you have to nip at the bud, and then you just have to move on. In situations where it gets a little bit worse, you know, we've had a couple of incidents this year, one of them being that at a trailhead in Greenburgh, Pennsylvania, several trees were tagged with swastikas. And so, you know, we had one of our staff members is Jewish, and she hikes in that area because she lived in Frederick, Maryland. And that is an incredibly traumatic experience for her because all four of her grandparents were Holocaust survivors. So can you imagine trying to find peace and tranquility, and that's what you see? That's a very jarring experience because here you are seeking solace and inspiration in a natural space, and all of a sudden you have visual triggers that bring up historical trauma. So, you know, like those are just isolated incidents in her experience and my experience, but they are informative in the sense that it may not be physical violence, and it may not be that you're being stalked, for example. It may be that you're dealing with microaggressions that you have to be very proactive at stopping immediately because they are impacting your trail experience. Yeah, and maybe we'll approach this question from the standpoint of just harassment in general, you know, because, you know, a key statistics that I always come back to is that more than half of women who've been on public lands report being sexually harassed. So it may not be that it's because of who you are racially or ethnically, it may be who you are gender-wise. It could be because of your sexual orientation and because people perceive you to be gay or lesbian or queer, whatever. Like in any of those instances, what do you do if you're harassed? So you have a lot of options available to you. The first is if you feel like you're in danger, we have those emergency numbers listed, right? So you can call 911 and say, an individual is harassing me. I feel unsafe. I need intervention and support. There's also the NPS, incident line. So if there's somebody who's just making you feel uncomfortable and you want to report suspicious behavior, you can contact the National Park Service line. There's also safety in numbers. So one phenomenon that we didn't talk about is the trail family. So I haven't met a lot of people that haven't had a trail family. Trail families are basically, you just organically over time find your people. And as much as this is like a solo endeavor for a lot of people, it ends up becoming a family endeavor because you stick with that group up and down the trail. And you might actually swap families. I had 2 trail families. A lot of the people in my trail family actually got norovirus in Virginia. So I just kept going and I ended up entering into a new family for the northern part of the trail. But I actually found quite a bit of safety by sticking with my trail family in towns when I'm dealing with a whole bunch of new people or strangers. So when I'm at a hostel, for example, or when I'm staying at this like motel and I don't really feel safe going to the gas station to get some Gatorade at 2:00 at night, I go with my trail family. Like I razz them out of their sleeping bags. I'm like, come on, guys, I need to get some electrolytes and some ice cream. You guys are coming with me because I don't feel safe.
I'm wondering if there's a resource for, I plan on doing like I don't know the exact term. I know that you have one, like a version of the flip flop. And so it's not going to be like consistent. And I guess I'm wondering if there's there are places where I have hiked alone and I have experienced a lot of harassment. And I'm wondering if there's I don't know if it would be the trail mentor thing, but just like a BIPOC social network of hey, I'm going to be on this part during this time. Does anybody want to hike? Is there any kind of network like that?
Yeah, I would start with the mentor list for sure. It was very helpful for me. Many of the mentors that I reached out to were up and down the trail. So they actually had to end up being my kind of de facto trail angels. I'd just be like, hey, I'm getting closer to Delaware Water Gap. And they'd be like, you know what? I live in Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania. It's 10 minutes away. I'm driving over with pie in hand. And you're like, cool, done. But those people were also people that were helping me identify the resources that I need when I'm going in those areas that are a little bit more dicey, right? So they were like, hey, here's a couple of people that you can contact. Here's a phone number that you can keep on hand so that you can stay safe. So that's one part, is make sure if you're inclined to reach out to those mentors and really make yourself like a cold call introduction, that's absolutely an option. The other is I am not a social media person. I'm actually not on any social media, but one of the things that our communications team tracks is different groups on Facebook where you can find your people. And there are BIPOC groups that are like the thru-hiker classes. There are also BIPOC hiking groups. And the Women Who Hike group is absolutely phenomenal. It's like 10,000 women who live up and down the trail corridor who basically have created this de facto network to support other women. And the last piece of it is affinity groups. So we have 2 that are solidly formed. The Wild East Women group is really phenomenal, and they're up and down the trail, but we also have Latinx hikers too. And we're starting to kick off more affinity groups. So if you're inclined again, to introduce yourself to those people and make that connection, they're great communities to get into, so that the more people you build up around you, the more contacts you have as you make your way along the journey. So I see in the chat, Sahaj, I'm not sure if you see this. Sorry, I'm not able to turn my camera. This is from Catherine. But I'd love to hear from y'all what you'd like from white cis friends and hikers on the trail, aside from stepping in, challenging microaggressions and threats. Actually, there's a great question for Sahaj. What do you think about allyship?
Yeah, I think being a white person on the trail, you just have to keep in mind that the perception could be different, right? Like the ally markers I talked about earlier. You don't want to make judgments, and you don't want to assume someone is okay with a certain joke, or someone is has a certain lifestyle because of the way they look. You want to make people feel welcomed, and you know, it's their trail as much as yours. And you have to remember that on both ends, whether you're BIPOC or white. And you just want to make people feel like they belong. And I think that's just what, when I'm on the trail, that's just what's going through my mind. Everybody's here for their own journey. Everybody has their own hike. And you take from the public land and you give back to the public land. And yeah, if you have anything to add on, Charlene, but I just want to kind of echo a couple of points from the previous two questions on stuff Charlene mentioned. You know, feel free to be that person who tells your group or trail family or anybody else, hey, I don't feel safe. You know, bring it up. That's what you should do. And be that person who cold calls a mentor, or be that person who has to reach out to a resource. Be that person. Do it. It's encouraged. You know, if you have to second guess it, you probably have to do it.
I'm sure you guys are biased, but what's your favorite resource for somebody who's new to hiking? And, you know, what's that favorite book that really just was like, this really was the most helpful resource for you?
I'll go first since mine is not too specific. I'll start with the ATC website. Everything I know about the Appalachian Trail is through the ATC because, you know, I started volunteering with them through NextGen before I even started hiking it. And they're, you know, they really have stepped up their game in terms of trying to, you know, make people feel comfortable, have the resources there. And their website is full of one-pagers and you know, videos maybe like this that are just general knowledge, great to know before you do your thru hike.
My entryway to the trail is books. I think the most undersold book about the Appalachian Trail and trails in general is Robert Moore's On Trails. It is a phenomenal book. And here's the way that I think about it in my mind. If you're going to invest thousands of dollars and several months into this experience, you might as well know what it is that you're hiking on and why it's there. And Robert Moore's On Trails really talks about the history and the anthropology of trails. Like, why do we even have trails? Why is it that we're so compelled to hike on them? And why is it ultimately at the end of the day such a magical experience? Well, he kind of tells you why. And it's good to have that kind of philosophical and historical grounding before you embark on this amazing experience. So I'm going to put it in the chat. It's Robert Moore, and it's called On Trails. He is a writer for The New Yorker. He's also a staff writer for Outside Magazine. And just there's something to be said about somebody who's thru hiked, who has those writing chops and can articulate that experience in a compelling way. So.
Yeah, I just picked up The Unlikely Thru-Hiker. It's written by a Black man named
Derek Lugo.
There you go.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if there are more BIPOC authors that you can think of.
Yeah, Derek's is kind of like the go-to for BIPOC hikers. If you're not like looking for a book, there's really good articles on Melanin Base Camp is a really great website. If you're an Insta person, you know, like there's a couple of handles that are awesome. Brown People Camping, the founder of that organization, Ambreen Tariq, is on our board of directors. She's also just a phenomenal human being. And then there's a couple of really great authors out there and really great individual hikers. Acuna, his real name is Will Robinson, has a really phenomenal Instagram account. Elise, and her trail name is Chardonnay, but her name is Elise Walker. She's the first Black woman to Triple Crown. She's an excellent person to follow on socials. I also think that another great website to go to if you want to find your tribe is really the Diversify Outdoors Coalition. One of the people who's on that website is Jalen Go, and she founded the Native Women's Wilderness, and she's really established the standard of what it means to communicate experience to BIPOC communities. And I just love the way that she writes about it. And the last piece that I can share with you is that if you're inclined to do so, there's a whole bunch of websites that are available on the Partnership for National Trail Systems website. They have actually what they call a BIPOC library or JEDI library. JEDI stands for Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. And They share that library with a whole bunch of other trail organizations. And then I don't know, you guys have probably heard of this website, but it's called The Trek. The Trek has a reading list of really great articles and books that are written by BIPOC hikers about their experience. Well, I will close on this, but I'm really happy that you came out today. And I think that you guys are about to embark on an amazing journey, but be safe, plan ahead, prepare, and have the experience that you want. So thank you.